I want to consider the idea of an Islamic state, and I don't mean ISIS, I'm referring to the classical Sunni understanding of the Islamic state, and compare that with the modern Western secular liberal understanding of the state, with particular reference to sovereignty and power. And to do that, I will be drawing on the work of Shabbir Akhtar, who is a lecturer in Islamic theology at the University of Oxford, in his book Islam as Political Religion, The Future of an Imperial Faith. And interestingly, he has a PhD in Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist Christian philosopher, probably the only Muslim in the world that has that. He writes in his book on page 149, the Islamic State is a manifestation and instrument of power, the power of the Sharia. It is a theonomocracy with God as king or sovereign, Malik in the Arabic. Theonomocracy meaning God ruling by law. And one of the verses he refers to is 62:1 in the Qur'an, which reads, "Whatsoever is in the heavens and whatsoever is on the earth glorifies Allah, the King of everything, the Holy, the Almighty, the All-Wise." The Islamic State is not a clerical theocracy, since classically Islam has no priesthood. The political office of Ayatollah as supreme jurist is a modern innovation and restricted to Shiite theology. He has in mind here, I'm sure, Iran. The pursuit of justice is absolute. It transcends the Sharia and reflects the character of God as just master. The Sharia is a means to an end and is judged by its ability to administer justice. As a substantive, humanitarian, and universal value, justice transcends all legal systems and faiths. For Muslims, it is furthermore a metaphysically absolute ideal ordained by God. Justice is defined in Islam as due but not absolute regard for human freedom and equality. The pursuit of absolute freedom is condemned as license. Muslim radicals can concur with the Marxist analysis of bourgeois laws as concealed instruments of class control and class warfare, parading as harbingers of fantastic freedoms. The rebel despises the law, but the law creates the rebel as criminal before also catching and punishing him. So much for absolute freedom. The option of giving or withholding consent to the state is part of the political mythology of secular liberalism. In practice, no citizen has such a choice. The liberal state ensures obedience by permitting and encouraging the individual to believe that he or she has a real option to refuse the state's orders. In Western societies, the correct relationship between religion and politics, between church and state, has been legally, coercively imposed, not freely sanctioned by the private morals or the conscience of citizens, although most Westerners imagined that they had a choice in this matter. The de facto reality of the self-defined state as absolutely sovereign is a fait social, which resolves this elemental issue through a dogmatic declaration of laicism. In other words, the state is completely secular, completely neutral. This is particularly seen in France. No religion or religious institution has the right to interfere with the sovereignty of the state, proclaims the state. The authority of the state is grounded on the monopolistic claim of the state. It claims to be the sole final regulator of behaviour of its citizens. It expresses its sovereign character simply by claiming it. This claim is not rational, but assertive and dogmatic. Like the god of the mature Semitic monotheisms, the state simply exists. Conservative apologists ex post facto explain the state's sovereignty as the will of its citizens. To preserve the myth of absolute liberty professed by democratic politics, the secular liberal state has a monopoly on politics as coercion. Who gave it that right? The Western nation-state, through its potestas, through its power, dethroned God and put itself in its place as an act of coercion, not reason. The liberal state arose by destroying the sovereign, sometimes literally. I think Akhtar must have in mind Charles I in England, of course. Liberal statehood was the antithesis, not the fulfillment, of sovereignty. Apart from the human sovereign, God was the unstated competitor against the state, not merely a willing partner who had agreed to take a second place in the queue for the sake of the tranquility of the kingdom. Through its legal and political mechanisms, the European state actively removed God from the public arena and kept him in his private space. Hegel, the German philosopher, was right, and for once intelligible, when he proclaimed that the state has moved to occupy the functional place of the deity. More charitably, the secular state actively replaces a sovereign God with a sovereign good. In principle, the modern state need not mention religion at all. Statesmen can leave unanswered the question of the role of God's law, thus diplomatically avoiding conflict by shelving the issues. Western states, European states, declare their policy. Religion is a private matter with which the state is not concerned and which should not manifest itself in the public sphere. Islam's confession, there is no God except God, dethrones the state as God. In the Muslim world, the dethronement of organized institutional religion was, in recent centuries, attempted in imitation of Western models. It has now been actively reversed in several Islamic theocracies. God is the true and sole sovereign of the Ummah, its source of authority, and one indispensable source and enabler of legislation and moral virtue. For Muslims, the test of divine sovereignty is the power to legally revoke, in the name of God, secular law itself. The religious right to rescind the secular right to legislate is the rival moral and legal foundation of the Sharia. Muslims charge that in secular legal codes, God's rights, because God has rights, over his human servants are neglected in favour of absolute human rights. Islam, as a juristic monotheism, claims to balance these sets of rights. That's a wonderful way of putting it. The Qur'an is not fully compatible with a secular notion of human rights and does not deliver the same set of rights. Thus, for example, even the de jure rights of Muslim women, and these are remarkably extensive in Islamic law, though not in Islamic practice, differ from those secured by a Western feminism determined to achieve maximal rights for women while, from certain viewpoints, potentially neglecting the rights of the family and the legitimate grievances of men. The Qur'an contained revealed legislation, and the Sunnah was fixed by Muhammad's lifestyle and approved by God. Both were imposed on believers, authoritatively by fiat of revelation, not by consensus or individual ratiocination. The Qur'an and Muhammad's traditions, the first four caliphs and the first four imams of the legal schools, together define what most Sunni Muslims see as their legally and morally binding tradition. The righteous elders, al-Salaf al-Saleh, include the Prophet, his companions, and the generation which succeeded them. In popular piety, their actions are considered normative. We can better assess this claim after examining the scope and sources of Islamic law, which he then goes on to do. So that's the end of that quote. I think there's a particular sentence here which I think is so radical. It's much more radical than Marxism or communism or any other ism in the West. The single sentence, Islam's confession, there is no God except God, dethrones the state as God. Whatever the state is, a Marxist state, a liberal democratic state, or a fascist state, Islam's confession, there is no God except, dethrones that state as God, and God himself, the real God, is the sovereign. I think it's an extraordinary statement, that. And also the notion of God's rights. This is completely absent from Western discourse. Muslims charge that in secular legal codes, God's rights over his human servants are neglected in favour of absolute human rights. And Islam, as a juristic monotheism, in other words, a monotheism concerned with law, seeks to balance these sets of rights, God's rights and the rights of his servants. It's an extraordinary worldview, and in my view, incompatible with a secular liberal notion of the state. And so, yeah, this book is fascinating. I do recommend it. I have read it, and it's full of pen marks and crossings and dots and everything I put in here as I interacted with the text, and I do recommend it to you as well. Like virtually everything I read, I don't necessarily agree with everything that Dr. Shabbir Akhtar says, but he certainly gives lots of food for thought, a veritable banquet for the mind, and on that basis I do recommend it to you. Until next time.